Welcome to an introduction to educational research, and today's video has to do with research vocabulary. And the intent of the video is to go over some important research terminology in order that we can have a shared research vocabulary when we're talking about research. An important skill for you to develop is the ability to read and analyze and interpret and critique educational research. A working knowledge of the vocabulary that will be presented here will assist you in that task. And if you'll allow me just a minute to digress and to complain a little bit, a brief comment concerning reading and evaluating educational research. I've been teaching since 1969, and I know that's way, way too long. They need to put me out the pasture. That's approximately 50 years. And my time has been equally divided between university teaching and the New York City public school system. It has not been unusual for me to encounter veteran teachers who have not read a research article or even attended a professional conference since they left graduate school and started teaching. I'm well aware as teachers we have way, way too many responsibilities to take care of. But the major responsibility we have is to our clients or our students. And we're responsible to them to be the best prepared to work with them in the most efficient and effective manner. I mean, come on, you wouldn't want the person who's about to perform a very delicate brain surgery operation on you to not have kept abreast of the latest developments in brain surgery. So our major responsibility is to be prepared. Okay, so enough of my soapbox. Let's take a look at some of the research vocabulary. At the bottom of your screen are 6 terms that are presented in this video. A variable, an independent variable, dependent variable, extraneous or confounding variables, controlled variables, and internal validity. You may already know some or all of these terms, but just in case, I'm going to briefly go over each one. And again, the reasoning is a solid working knowledge of these terms will go a long way in sharpening your ability to analyze and critique educational research. At the end of the video is fairly brief. At the end of the video is an assignment for you to respond in writing to. As always, there may be several writing assignments to respond to in terms of this total assignment that you're working on. Please put all of those responses just in one Word document, just one Word document. And then when you're done with the total assignment, please email it to me. All right, so we'll start with the concept of the variable. Researchers study variables and their effects. And we might actually metaphorically view variables as empty boxes that can take on different values depending on how the researcher defines them. And I'm sure we all remember variables from our high school algebra classes. Variables were usually designated by letter names like X and Y and Z and so on. And as you can see on your screen, we have 3 variables, X, Y, and Z. And that particular algebraic expression says if we add the value of variable X to the value of variable Y, we'll get the value of variable Z. And theoretically, X and Y can take on any values assigned to them, and Z will then be the sum of those values. So, just as an example, we can put 10 in X, 5 in Y, and then Z becomes the sum of those. Or we can put 4 in X, 7 in Y, and Z becomes the sum. Okay, those were variables we were used to in working in algebra. In research, variables serve a somewhat different function. At its most basic level, experimental research involves the systematic manipulation or application of one variable on a second variable and then observing the effects, if any, at the first variable had on the second variable. So on your screen, you now see three different variables. One labeled, intervention, one labeled behavior, and the third labeled result. So as an example, suppose a researcher was interested in the intervention of using a token economy, the intervention of using a token economy on out-of-seat behavior of students in a fifth grade math class. Well, that's those variables. Intervention is one variable. The token economy would be the intervention, and the behavior would be out-of-seat behavior. It's an example of the variables. Computer time could be the computer time, the use of computer time. Students get extra computer time if they reduce their call-outs. Those are other variables, which are very different than the algebraic ones. So this manipulation by the researcher of an intervention or a treatment, they're basically the same, and observing its effects on a behavior is a hallmark of experimental research. So the manipulation by the researcher of an intervention or treatment on a behavior is a hallmark of experimental research. In educational research, the intervention or treatment has a special name. The intervention or treatment is typically referred to as the independent variable. In a research study, the independent variable is the treatment or intervention that is differentially applied by the researcher in order to observe any changes in the behavior. So in the example that appeared on your screen, we have the intervention DRO, which stands for differential reinforcement of other behavior. It's a typical intervention, and the behavior that we're going to use it on is off task. So the intervention DRO is the independent variable. The independent variable is the cause in a cause and effect relationship. And it is the antecedent. It comes first. So, as our example on the screen, in a research study that looked at the effects of differential reinforcement of other behavior, that's the independent variable. So it's type of reinforcement, differential reinforcement of other behavior. That is the independent variable, the type of intervention, the type of treatment. A clue to remembering that independent variable refers to intervention is that they both begin with the letter I. So intervention and independent variable begin with the letter I. So the intervention then goes by a special name, the independent variable. You can always identify the independent variable in a research study by asking yourself, what is the intervention? What is the treatment that the researchers are using? So if you look at on the top of your screen, it says in a research study titled The Effects of Positive Reinforcement on Task Behavior. The independent variable, the treatment or the intervention, is type of reinforcement. Type of reinforcement, not positive reinforcement. It's the type of reinforcement because the researcher will use positive reinforcement and at other times maybe no reinforcement or a different kind, negative reinforcement. But the key point here is the intervention or the treatment in a research study is referred to as the independent variable. That's the special name for the treatment or intervention. And the behavior that's being observed or being measured, in this case off-task behavior, also goes by a special name. And it is called the dependent variable. The behavior being observed is always referred to as the dependent variable. And it is the effect or the change in behavior as a result of the application of the intervention strategy or treatment, which is the independent variable. The change in behavior is dependent on the application of the intervention or independent variable, and therefore is dependent on it, thus the name dependent variable. You can usually always determine the dependent variable in a research study by asking yourself, what are the researchers collecting data on? Well, in a research article entitled The Effects of Positive Reinforcement on On-Task Behavior, you can see that on the top of your screen in the yellow box. What are the researchers collecting data on? They're collecting data on on-task behavior. So the dependent variable is on-task behavior. So now we have an independent variable or a treatment or an intervention. And in this case, it's DRO, differential reinforcement of other behavior. And we have a dependent variable or the effect, which is off-task behavior. Researchers apply the independent variable, the treatment, to a dependent variable, the behavior of interest, and then they observe the effect. But it's not quite that simple, not quite that easy. Suppose in a research looking at the effect of, let's say, positive reinforcement on on-task behavior, we find that positive reinforcement is applied and on-task behavior increases. Well, it seems to be working. We're using positive reinforcement and the on-task behavior of students is increasing. However, unbeknownst to us, the students' parents have gotten back together. Let's say a particular student's parents have gotten back together after a long separation, which caused the student to be anxious and nervous. Now the student is much happier and calmer. So there is a possible alternative reason or explanation for the increase in on-task behavior. And this brings us to our next vocabulary term: extraneous or confounding variables. Assume we wish to test the hypothesis that children taught by the inductive method, let's say the group A, show greater gains in learning scientific concepts than children taught by the deductive method, and let's say that's group B. Well, take a look at your screen. We have an independent variable. We have a treatment. And it is the type of method that the students are being taught, either inductive or deductive teaching method. And that's in the orange box. That's the independent variable, the treatment. And in the blue box, we have the dependent variable, what the researchers are measuring. They're measuring the scientific concepts that students have learned. So in this example, teaching method, inductive versus deductive, is the independent variable, and the learning of scientific concepts is the dependent variable, and that's what's being measured. In order to draw a conclusion as to which teaching method is most effective in students learning scientific concepts, we must rule out the possibility that the outcome is due to some extraneous, usually unmeasured variable. An extraneous variable is a variable that is not related to the purpose of the study, but may affect the dependent variable or what's being measured, in this case, the concepts that are learned. And in this example, students' aptitude, their ability, would be an extraneous factor that would certainly affect the learning of scientific concepts. Students of higher aptitude would most likely learn more concepts. And other examples of possible extraneous or confounding variables might include student motivation to learn, the amount of sleep the student had the night before, did they have breakfast, and so on. There could be many, many different extraneous confounding variables. So aptitude or motivation or lack of sleep are examples of variables that confound the relationship between the variable types of teaching method and scientific concepts learned in such a way that their effects cannot be separated. So extraneous or confounding variables offer alternative explanations concerning the results of a study under investigation, and they leave those results suspect. So it is very important that researchers limit or control for extraneous or confounding variables, that may muddle the results of an experiment. So control becomes a big factor in scientific experiments. And here's an example. And this is taken from the physical sciences. Researchers are interested in applying a treatment or strategy or intervention, which would be an independent variable, to a given sample and observing the effects of the independent variable on the sample. And as stated earlier, it is important that all other extraneous and confounding variables are controlled so that the results of the intervention can be reliably calculated. So if you look at the diagram, we see the independent variable. And the example here is it's the liquid used to water each plant. And plant A is getting, looks like soda, looks like a soda can. Plant B is getting a juice, and plant C looks like is getting water. So those are the treatments. Now the dependent variable in this case, you can see in the example, it says the height or health of the plant. So that's what's being measured, the dependent variable. But you can see under controlled, everything you want to remain constant and unchanging, and they give some examples. The type of plant you would want to control for, the size of the pot that the plant is in, the amount of liquid that is used, the type of soil that is used, possibly fertilizers that are used. All of these factors would need to be controlled by the researcher. One of the major reasons that it is very important for the researcher to attempt to control all variables that are not under investigation is that it increases the internal validity of the inferences that we can draw from the study. And internal validity is our next vocabulary. Internal validity. If a research study has strong internal validity, we can infer with a high degree of probability that it is the independent variable, the intervention strategy or treatment, and the independent variable alone that was the cause of the change in the dependent variable or the behavior. Internal validity is concerned with such questions as, did the experimental treatment cause the observed change in the dependent variable, or was some extraneous or confounding factor working? Or are the findings accurate? Internal validity is essentially a problem of control. You would want to ask yourself as you're reading research articles, has the researcher built into the research design appropriate ways to eliminate extraneous variables that could lead to alternative explanations of the results? Anything that contributes to the control of the design contributes to the internal validity of the study. Now, you can see that on your screen. You see the graphic and the green oval. Inside the study, that's internal validity. Was the research done right? Were extraneous and confounding variables controlled for? And next, we have the concept of external validity. Now, external validity refers to the extent to which the findings of a study can be generalized to other subjects, other settings, and other treatments. As an example, any single study is necessarily performed on a particular group of subjects, so a sample, with selected measuring instruments and under conditions that are in some respects unique to that particular study. But as researchers, we would like the results of our study to give us information about a larger realm of subjects, about the population that our sample was drawn from, and other conditions and operations than were actually investigated. Would a teaching method, let's say, found to be highly effective in an affluent school district be as effective in a financially struggling school district? Can the results be generalized? To make generalizations from what was observed to what was not observed, researchers need to assess how well the sample of events actually studied represent the larger population at large. The extent that the inferences about a causal relationship hold over different subjects or different settings or different treatments, the experiment is said to have external validity. So, a research study has strong external validity when the results of the study can be generalized from the sample that was under study to the population that the sample was drawn from. The better the ability to generalize, the stronger the external validity. The less generalizability, the weaker the results. So, internal validity has to do with controlling for extraneous and confounding variables that will offer alternative explanations to a study. If a study has very good internal validity, we can infer with a high degree of probability that it is the independent variable that has caused the change in the behavior of the dependent variable. On the other hand, external validity deals with the generalizability of the findings. Can the findings be generalized to other samples, to other institutions, to other schools, to other populations? So that is the difference between the internal and external validity. Here is your assignment for this video. And it says in each of the studies listed below, and there are 10 studies listed below, 1 to 10 and then 11 is a different question. It says identify the following: the independent variable, the dependent variable, and extraneous or confounding variables that should be controlled for. So, number 1, a study designed to determine the effect of varying amounts of sleep deprivation on learning nonsense syllables. Well, you'd have to identify the independent variable. So, what is it that there is the treatment or the intervention? And the dependent variable, what is it the researchers are measuring? That would be the dependent variable. And then what might be possible extraneous or confounding variables? Okay, so this is just part of your total assignment. So as usual, incorporate your written responses into one document. And when you're done with all of the assignment, email me the document. For your information, here are some resources that were used in putting this video together. Thank you very much for your time. I'm sorry for the length. It went over 20 minutes. That gets a little boring. But thank you, and see you next time.